Hi, my name is Alex. Today, I want to share a story that has been weighing heavily on my heart. It's not an easy story to tell, but I think it's time to put it out there. This is the story of my marriage to Sarah. How it started as a dream and ended in heartbreak. Like most love stories, ours began innocently enough. I met Sarah 6 years ago at a friend's party. She was everything I had ever wanted. Her laughter filled the room, her eyes sparkled with life, and she carried this contagious energy that drew people toward her. She was spontaneous, full of life, and completely irresistible. I knew I had to get to know her better. And just like that, we hit it off instantly. Everything between us felt effortless. Our conversations flowed like water, and when we were together, time simply didn't exist. Within a few months, we were inseparable. I was convinced Sarah was the one. Looking back now, I wonder if I was blinded by love or if I just saw what I wanted to see. In the early days of our marriage, everything seemed perfect. We bought a small house together and settled into what felt like the dream life. Mornings were spent drinking coffee and talking about our future. We'd laugh, plan vacations, and even discuss starting a family someday. It was the kind of life I had always imagined. But perfection is fragile. And it wasn't long before cracks started to show. First, they were small, things you could easily brush off. Sarah started working late more often. She'd come home exhausted, barely say a word, and head straight to bed. I didn't think much of it at first. Work can be stressful, and I wanted to be a supportive husband. Then she started canceling our weekend plans, saying she needed to catch up on work or just rest. That's when I noticed how attached she had become to her phone, always in her hand, messages lighting up the screen at all hours. When I asked her about it, she simply said, "It's just work." And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But something had changed. We were living under the same roof, yet emotionally we were worlds apart. I remember one night, about a year into our marriage, when I finally confronted her. I sat beside her and asked, "Sarah, is everything okay between us?" To seem distant. She looked at me, expressionless, and said, "Everything's fine, Alex. You're imagining things." But I wasn't. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to fix it. I tried everything. Planning surprise dates, arranging weekend getaways, anything to bring us back to the way we were. But it felt like Sarah had already checked out emotionally. And no matter what I did, I couldn't reach her. The more effort I put in, the colder she became. And then came the lies. First, they were small. She'd say she was out with friends, but when I called one of them, they had no idea what I was talking about. She'd tell me she was working late, but I'd drive past her office, and the building would be dark. I wanted to trust her. I needed to trust her. But the more it happened, the clearer it became. Something was seriously wrong. One evening I finally asked her outright, "Sarah, I know you're not being honest with me. Where are you really going when you say you're working late? Who are you texting all the time?" She exploded. "How dare you accuse me of lying?" He shouted. "I work hard to keep this house running, and this is how you repay me. By questioning everything I do." I was stunned. I hadn't expected her to get so defensive. But what hurt the most wasn't her anger. It was how easily she twisted it around, making me feel like the bad guy, like I was the one overreacting. After that fight, I started to doubt myself. Was I really imagining things? Was I being unreasonable? But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when you don't want to see it. One night, Sarah left for the store and forgot to take her phone with her. It buzzed on the kitchen counter. I know I shouldn't have, but curiosity got the better of me. Picked it up. And there it was. Texts from someone named David. They weren't work-related, far from it. They were personal, intimate. My heart sank. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to process it. Over the next few days, I watched her more closely. I saw the way she'd smile at her phone, the way she'd leave the room whenever she got a call. Everything suddenly made sense. The late nights, the lies, distance. Sarah was having an affair. When I finally confronted her, there was no screaming, no dramatic fight. I just asked, "Who is David?" Her face went pale. She stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but it was too late. The damage was done. "I'm sorry, Alex," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far." I stood there, stunned, trying to process what I was hearing. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built my life around, had betrayed me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to ask her why. Why she did this to me, to us. But I didn't. I just felt numb. She tried to explain, saying she had felt trapped in our marriage, that she didn't know how to tell me she was unhappy. But none of it mattered. The trust was broken. There was no going back. We tried counseling, but it was useless. Sarah had emotionally checked out of our marriage long before the affair even started. In the end, there was only one option left. We got divorced. It was painful, but staying in a marriage where I was constantly questioning my worth, my trust, my sanity, that would have been even worse. Looking back, I wish I had seen the signs sooner. Maybe I could have done something to save us. Or maybe we were doomed from the start. I don't know. What I do know is this. Love isn't enough. Not without trust. Not without communication. After the divorce, I moved out of the house that was supposed to be our forever home. Every corner of it held memories, and staying there would have felt like living with ghosts. So I packed my things and left. The first few weeks were the hardest. The questions haunted me. What went wrong? Why didn't I see it coming? Was I not enough? I buried myself in work, taking on extra projects just to avoid the emptiness of my apartment. It helped, at least for a while. But the loneliness had a way of creeping back in the moment I stopped moving. Then one evening, months after the divorce, I ran into Sarah at the grocery store. Neither of us had expected it. She looked surprised, guilty. I was standing by the produce section, absent-mindedly staring at some apples when she turned the corner. It was awkward. We made small talk, the kind you have with an old acquaintance you barely know anymore. Not with someone you once planned a life with. "How have you been?" she asked hesitantly. Shrugged. "You know. Taking it one day at a time." She nodded, biting her lip, as if she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. I didn't have the energy for a real conversation, so I just gave her a small nod, turned around, and walked away. That night, as I walked out of the grocery store, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had moved on. Maybe she was still with David, maybe she wasn't, but what bothered me most was that I still cared. I didn't want to care. She had hurt me, and yet she was still occupying space in my mind. It wasn't until I had a long talk with my best friend, Mike, that I started to see things more clearly. Mike and I had been friends since college, and throughout this entire ordeal, he had been my rock. One night, over a couple of beers, he gave me the tough love I didn't realize I needed. "Alex," he said, looking me straight in the eye, "you need to stop punishing yourself for this. You didn't make her cheat. You didn't make her lie. That's on her. You did everything you could to save that marriage." I wanted to argue. I wanted to pick apart his words and search for the ways I might have failed. But deep down I knew he was right. I had tried. Maybe I had been naive. Maybe I had ignored the signs for too long, but I wasn't to blame for Sarah's choices. Accepting that truth wasn't easy. The guilt and doubt had become a habit, one I didn't know how to break. That was when I decided to see a therapist. At first, I wasn't sure what I expected to get out of it, but I figured talking to someone might help. And it did. Little by little, I started to see that the end of my marriage didn't define me. It was just a chapter, one I had to close in order to move forward. I learned to forgive myself for not being able to fix everything. Some things can't be fixed. Some things just end. And that's okay. As the months went by, I slowly started rebuilding my life. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I had neglected during my marriage, and focused on rediscovering who I was, outside of being someone's husband. I took a photography class, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I went hiking more often, exploring places I had meant to visit but never did because Sarah wasn't interested. And then, one day something unexpected happened. I was sitting in a coffee shop, working on some emails, when a woman approached me. She had kind eyes, dark hair pulled into a loose bun, and a warm smile that put me instantly at ease. "Excuse me," she said, holding up a book. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading the same book as me." I glanced down at my copy of The Alchemist and smiled. Great minds think alike, I guess. We started talking about books, about life, about everything in between. Her name was Emily, and there was something about her. Maybe it was her kindness, maybe it was how she genuinely listened, but for the first time in a long time I felt a spark of hope. It wasn't like I was falling head over heels, but I felt something I hadn't in ages. A connection. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I ran into each other at the same coffee shop a few more times. Each time, our conversations lasted a little longer, became a little deeper. I found myself looking forward to those moments in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. Eventually, I asked her out to dinner, and to my surprise, she said yes. We had a great time, and as the evening ended, I realized something important. I was ready to open up again. Not necessarily to fall in love, but to let someone new into my life. For so long, I had been holding on to the pain of my past, afraid to move forward. But sitting there with Emily, I realized that it was okay to start over. It was okay to hope again. Our relationship didn't blossom overnight. It was slow, cautious. I was still healing, still learning to trust again. And Emily understood that. She didn't push me. She didn't expect me to be fully healed. For the first time I felt like I was with someone who saw me for who I was. Flaws and all. In time, I let go of the anger I had towards Sarah. I stopped blaming her. And more importantly, I stopped blaming myself. Some relationships aren't meant to last forever. That doesn't mean they were a failure. Just means they ran their course. One evening, months into my relationship with Emily, we were sitting by the river, watching the sunset. The conversation drifted, and eventually I told her about Sarah, about the affair, the divorce, the way it had shattered me. I expected her to be uncomfortable, maybe even pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she just listened, quietly nodding, letting me know she was really there. When I finished, she placed her hand over mine and said something I'll never forget. "Alex, you've been through a lot. But that doesn't mean you're broken. You're just human. We all have scars. But it's how we move forward that matters." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long I had seen myself as damaged. Someone who had failed at one of the most important relationships of his life. But in that moment, with Emily's quiet reassurance, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I thought. We continued to grow closer, and with each passing day, I healed in ways I hadn't even realized I needed. Emily brought a lightness into my life, a peace I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that she was kind or understanding, it was that she saw me, truly saw me, and accepted me without judgment. As I got to know her better, I learned that she had her own struggles, her own pain. Emily had lost her mother to cancer in her early 20s, and that grief had shaped much of who she was. But instead of letting it harden her, she had chosen to embrace life with an open heart. She believed in being present, in cherishing the small moments, because she knew how fragile life could be. Her outlook on life was contagious. Being around her made me want to be better, not just for her but for myself. One night, while we were curled up on the couch watching a movie, Emily turned to me and asked, "Do you ever talk to her?" "Sarah?" I asked, surprised. She nodded. "Yeah. Do you ever feel like you got closure?" I thought about it for a moment. Closure. For the longest time I had wanted answers. Answers Sarah couldn't or wouldn't give me. But as I sat there with Emily, I realized something. I didn't need them anymore. For so long I had obsessed over the questions that haunted me. Why Sarah cheated, why she didn't fight for our marriage, why she let it fall apart without so much as a real explanation. I had convinced myself that closure meant getting answers, that if I could just understand her reasons, I'd finally be able to move on. But sitting there with Emily, I realized something important. I don't think I need closure from her, I said slowly, choosing my words with care. I've spent so much time trying to make sense of what happened, but maybe it's not about getting answers from her. Maybe it's about accepting that sometimes things just end. And that's okay. Emily smiled, her eyes warm and understanding. I think that's a really healthy way to look at it. And it was. For the first time, I didn't feel the need for Sarah's validation or an apology. No explanation would ever fully undo the pain she caused. And I finally understood that healing had to come from within me. I had to let go of the need to dissect every detail of our past and just accept that it was over. Life moves forward whether we're ready or not. As the months passed, Emily and I grew even closer. We traveled together, met each other's families, and slowly started talking about the future. But unlike my relationship with Sarah, nothing felt rushed. With Emily, the future felt like something we were building together, piece by piece, at our own pace. One crisp autumn afternoon, we were walking through a park, the leaves crunching beneath our feet, when Emily suddenly stopped. She looked at me with a thoughtful expression, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "You know, Alex," she said, her voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us, about what we want." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Yeah. And what have you been thinking?" She smiled, a little shy but sure of herself. "I think I'm ready for more. For us to take that next step, whatever that looks like. I love you, and I want to build a life with you." Her words took me by surprise. Not because I didn't feel the same, but because I hadn't realized just how ready I was too. I had spent so much time guarding my heart, afraid of getting hurt again. But standing there with Emily looking at me with love and trust, I felt something shift inside me. I was ready. Ready to open my heart fully. Ready to take that risk. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I love you too, Emily. And I'm ready to build that life with you." It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment. No sweeping gestures or elaborate declarations. But it was real. And in that quiet exchange, I knew I had come full circle. I had gone from a man who was lost in the wreckage of his past to someone who had rebuilt his life, piece by piece, with the help of someone who truly saw him. For the first time in years, the future wasn't something I feared. It was something I looked forward to. With Emily by my side, whatever came next, I knew we would face it together. Open, honest, and unburdened by the past. We sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the distant hum of the city outside our window. The night felt peaceful, like the calm after a long storm. And in that moment I realized just how far I had come. I wasn't that broken, lost man anymore. But life, as I had learned, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few months after Emily and I moved in together, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in a long time. "Sarah." It was simple. No grand declarations, no dramatic confessions. Just a single line. "Hey Alex, it's been a while. I was wondering if we could meet up and talk." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the past stay where it belonged. But another part of me was curious. What could she possibly have to say after all this time? That evening I showed the message to Emily. She read it, then looked up at me with a calm expression. "What are you going to do?" I sighed. "I don't know. I don't feel like I need to talk to her, but at the same time, I kind of want to hear what she has to say. Does that make sense?" Emily nodded. "Does. Just remember, whatever you decide, I'm here." Her support meant everything to me. After thinking it over for a few days, I decided to meet with Sarah. Not because I needed closure, I had already found that within myself, but because I wanted to see where she was how she was doing. Maybe, in some small way, I needed to close that door for good. We met at a quiet cafe, the same one we used to go to in our early days together. Seeing Sarah again was strange. She looked different. Older, more tired, like life had worn her down in ways I hadn't expected. There was an awkwardness between us, a tension that wasn't hostile but wasn't exactly comfortable either. "Thanks for meeting with me," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But I figured we both deserved a chance to talk." Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. A long pause stretched between us before she finally spoke again. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry, Alex. For everything. For how I treated you. For how things ended. I know it's too late for apologies, but I needed to say it." Her words caught me off guard. I had imagined this conversation so many times, in so many different ways, but I never expected an apology. Not after all this time. "I appreciate that, Sarah," I said carefully. "But we both made mistakes. It wasn't all on you." She shook her head. "Oh, it was. I was the one who cheated. I was the one who gave up. You didn't deserve that." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. But looking at her now, I realized something important. Sarah wasn't the villain I had built up in my mind. She was just a person who had made bad choices, who had been lost in her own way. "I've moved on," I said finally, my voice steady. "I've healed. And I hope you have too." She smiled, but it was sad, almost regretful. "I'm trying. It's been hard, but I'm working on it." We talked for a little while longer about work, family, the usual things. But we didn't linger on the past. There was no need to rehash old wounds. When we finally said goodbye, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. As I walked back to the apartment I shared with Emily, I understood that meeting Sarah wasn't about closure. It wasn't about making peace with her. It was about making peace with myself. The past, no matter how painful, didn't define me anymore. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me. She looked at me with those warm, understanding eyes, and without a word, I knew she understood. "How did it go?" she asked softly. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "It went well," I said, a quiet certainty settling over me. "I think I can finally say goodbye to that part of my life." And I could. Meeting Sarah hadn't reopened old wounds. It had allowed me to close them for good. I realized that the love I once felt for her had faded into something else. Something that wasn't resentment or pain, but understanding and forgiveness. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Emily and I continued building our life together. We talked about the future, maybe buying a house, starting a family one day. But we weren't in a rush. We had learned that life doesn't always go according to plan. And that was okay. We were happy. And that was enough. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our new home, watching the sunset, Emily turned to me with a playful smile. "You know, Alex," she said, nudging me lightly, "I think we've got a pretty good thing going here." I looked at her, feeling that quiet, undeniable warmth in my chest, the kind I hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah," I said, smiling back. "I think so too." And in that moment I knew. Every heartache, every struggle, every painful lesson had led me to this. To this life. To this love. I had finally found my peace. But life, as I had learned, is never a straight path. One evening, about a year after we moved into our house, I came home from work to find Emily sitting at the dining room table, a letter in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes clouded with something heavy. "Hey," I said, setting my bag down. "Everything okay?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed me the letter, her fingers trembling slightly. I unfolded it and scanned the first few lines. My stomach dropped. It was from the hospital. Routine test results from Emily's recent checkup. But something had come back abnormal. They wanted her to come in for further testing. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said quickly, forcing a shaky smile. "Probably just a mistake. These things happen all the time, right?" But I could hear the fear in her voice. I could see it in the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. And in that moment, all the happiness, all the stability we had built together felt suddenly fragile. I reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "We'll go together," I said firmly. "We'll figure this out." She nodded, exhaling slowly. The next few weeks were a blur. Hospital visits, tests, waiting. The waiting was the worst part. Every phone call, every email, every possibility hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. And for the first time in a long time, I was afraid of what the future might bring. It felt like a ticking clock, counting down to something we couldn't control. Emily tried to stay positive, but I could see the cracks in her armor. For the first time since we had been together, I felt helpless. Couldn't fix this. I couldn't protect her from what was coming. Then the news came. Cancer. It wasn't what we had expected, but there it was. The doctor spoke in calm, clinical terms, explaining treatment options, prognosis, and the road ahead. But all I could hear was the word cancer, echoing in my mind, drowning out everything else. Emily was quiet on the drive home, staring out the window, her hands resting in her lap. I didn't know what to say. What do you say when the person you love most in the world is facing something like that? When we got home, she went straight to bed. I followed her, sitting on the edge of the mattress, unsure if she wanted to talk or be alone. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spoke. "I'm scared, Alex." Her voice was small, fragile. It broke something inside me to hear her sound so vulnerable, so unlike the strong, fearless woman I had fallen in love with. "I am too," I admitted, feeling the weight of those words settle between us. We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, neither of us knowing what the future held. But one thing was certain: whatever happened, we would face it together. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Emily started chemotherapy, and the side effects hit her hard. She lost weight, her hair, her energy. There were days when she could barely get out of bed, days when she was too sick to eat or even talk. It was heartbreaking to see her like that, this vibrant, full-of-life woman reduced to someone who had to fight just to make it through the day. But through it all, she never gave up. Even on her worst days, she would look at me with that same quiet determination and say, "We'll get through this." And I believed her. Had to. Because the alternative was too painful to even consider. Our friends and family rallied around us, offering support in every way they could. My parents, who lived a few hours away, would come to help whenever possible. Emily's sister, Katie, practically moved in with us during the roughest weeks, and having her there made a world of difference. But even with all the support, it was a battle we fought alone in the quiet moments, behind closed doors. There were nights when I would lie awake, listening to Emily's soft breathing beside me, wondering if we would ever get our old life back, the life we had built together, full of hope and dreams for the future. Now seemed like a distant memory. But then I would remember the promise I had made to her, that we would face this together. And I knew I couldn't let myself fall apart, not when she needed me to be strong. As the months went on, there were small victories. The treatments, though brutal, started to show signs of working. Emily's doctors were cautiously optimistic. Slowly, she began to regain some of her strength. It was a long, grueling process, but she was a fighter, and bit by bit, she started to come back to me. One afternoon, as we sat in the garden watching the flowers bloom, Emily turned to me with a tired but genuine smile. "I think I'm starting to feel like myself again," she said softly. I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling with relief. "I never doubted you for a second." She laughed, a weak but beautiful sound that I hadn't heard in far too long. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, we would make it through. We had already survived so much together, and I was ready to keep fighting for as long as it took. Months later, after what felt like an eternity, Emily went in for her final round of tests. The results were what we had been praying for. Remission. The cancer was gone. The doctors warned us that there was always a chance it could come back, but for now we could breathe again. We could live again. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a new beginning, a second chance at the life we had almost lost. That evening, as we sat on the porch of our home, watching the sun set over the horizon, Emily leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "We made it, didn't we?" I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close, and smiled. "Yeah, we did." And in that quiet moment I realized something. Life was never going to be perfect. It would always have its struggles, its heartbreaks, its challenges. But with Emily by my side, I knew we could face whatever came our way. Because love wasn't just about the good times. It was about standing together when things got hard, about choosing each other over and over again, no matter how tough the road became.